Why would the state let Bryan Kohberger take a plea deal? Why would the state ask for the death penalty and then suddenly allow Bryan Kohberger to take a plea deal so he doesn't ever have the death penalty? Today, as most of you know, he pled guilty to 4 counts of first degree murder and 1 count of burglary. In exchange for that, he has agreed to admit what he did and to serve 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He is waiving all of his rights to appeal, and he will not get the death penalty. It's pretty easy to see why Bryan Kohberger would take that deal. He had just lost all of his most important pretrial motions. He was just weeks away from a trial where the result was pretty much set in stone, and the end was very likely going to be that he would get the death penalty. But a lot of you may be wondering, why would the state agree to this deal? I mean, first blush, it might not seem fair, right? Bryan Kohberger pled guilty to one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, stabbing 4 innocent college students he didn't even know to death in the middle of the night. If this crime doesn't deserve the death penalty, then what crime does? For sure, this deal is not sitting well with a lot of people, especially the families. And the problems are made exponentially worse by the fact that some of the family members are saying that the state didn't even really consult them. It didn't discuss the deal with them first. Kaylee's dad, Steve Goncalves, said, they told us it's not really about us. It's about their process. Just shut up and get on board and deal with it. That's really what they told us. Now, I cannot imagine why any prosecutor would not have discussed this thoroughly with the families and gotten their input on this. Of course, they would want to be involved. And of course, they have every right to be involved. I can't speak to that. That makes no sense. What I want to talk about tonight is the first question I mentioned, which is why would the state agree to this deal? And I want to start by telling you about my experience as a young lawyer just out of law school. When I interviewed for a clerkship with a judge on the 11th Circuit, the judge warned me that there were a lot of death penalty cases in his court. I seriously underestimated what the judge meant by that. There were 3 of us who were clerks, and I ended up not being the one designated as the death penalty clerk, but it still became a huge part of my first year as a lawyer. I clerked for the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the federal court that covers Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. At that time, we handled more death penalty cases than any other circuit in the country. Every one of our states had the death penalty and was actively trying to use it. I say trying because there was a lot I had to learn about death penalty cases. I had just assumed that when the court handed down a death sentence, the defendant would be executed pretty shortly thereafter. There'd be an appeal, and then, I don't know, week 2, right away, there would be an execution. And I was very, very wrong about how that worked. I learned that it takes years, and in fact, often decades, between the time that the defendant is told he will get the death penalty and when he actually is executed. And there's not just one round of appeals. There are many, many death appeals for each case. State appeals, federal appeals, usually multiple of each. My co-clerk, Mike, was the assigned death penalty clerk for our year. When a prisoner was about to be executed, when the death penalty was coming up for that prisoner, we would get notice several days in advance, and the whole office would be on watch. The judge would have to be fully prepared. Mike and the judge would focus on the death penalty appeal. A ruling would have to be made within hours. And the other clerk and I would take up any slack for Mike. We were the last stop before the U.S. Supreme Court. And they'd be on notice too, ready to rule at a moment's notice. We'd leave work knowing that the final appeal had run through our office. We wouldn't know, what will the Supreme Court do? The next morning, we'd wake up and find out, had the person been executed, because it usually happens early in the morning. It was very sobering, and it taught me a lot. For one thing, a lot of what I thought about the death penalty was wrong. I realized that death sentences create decades of litigation. I tell you about my experience to give you kind of a brief introduction to what I'm thinking is the reason the state might want the plea deal with Kohberger. And The first is, like I said, that these cases take decades. The average time between sentencing and execution in the US is nearly 20 years. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, it's 18.9 years. Now, in Virginia, one of the fastest states, a study said it took 15. These are not outliers. These are averages. These are the norm. And think about that. What that means is if Bryan Kohberger went to trial in August, he might be convicted in, say, November. They were expecting a 3-month trial. But statistically speaking, he probably would not be executed until 2043. And that's if he followed the averages. And given how high profile his case is, I would say it could be much longer than that in his case. So prosecutors know that they are signing up for decades of litigation and appeals every time they seek the death penalty. The toll on the victims' families is very high in that situation. They may get media calls regularly for years. 20 years from now, a news station may be knocking on the door and asking them whether they think the courts are going to stay the upcoming execution for the third time. The second reason why the state might want the deal, that may surprise you. Most people who get the death sentence are never actually executed. Huge number of death sentences are reversed or commuted. Appellate courts look very hard at cases where a defendant has been given the death penalty. I know that from my personal experience. The final death penalty appeals have their own track. It would be tense when one of these went through. All of us in the office were fully aware of what this meant. Nobody wants to make a mistake in a death penalty case. So the appellate courts will pay very close attention to these cases. There are multiple rounds of appeals, state courts, federal courts, and all of that then gets appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. If any judge along that route is not completely sure, then the merry-go-round of appeals stops until the judge can finish looking at whatever the argument is, and then it starts up again. Columbia law found that 68% of death sentences from 1973 to 1995 were reversed due to what it called serious legal error. I think they were focused on the legal error part, but what I focus on with that statistic is how seriously appellate judges take these cases. They are literally life and death, and judges treat them that way. When a death penalty case gets reversed, rarely does it mean that the defendant is going to walk free, but it could mean that the defendant is going to get a new trial. And it might mean the defendant is going to get resentenced, maybe get life without parole instead of the death penalty. According to the Death Penalty Information Center, from 1973 to 2024, more than 9,000 people were sentenced to death in the United States, but only 1,600 have been executed. So 1 in 6. That gives you an idea of how hard it is and how long it takes. So when a prosecutor is deciding whether to seek the death penalty for Kohberger, they know that even if they win at trial, the chances that Bryan Kohberger is executed in the next 20 years, very, very low, even if the prosecutor wins. And there's a good chance he will never be executed at all, that he will die in his prison bed, which is the exact same result as if they never got the death penalty in the first place. The third reason the prosecution may decide not to go forward with the death penalty litigation is that it costs taxpayers a lot. It's very hard to get accurate data about the cost of death penalty appeals. Most of the organizations that compile this sort of data also have pretty strong opinions, either for the death penalty or more often against the death penalty. But you can just instinctively see that it's going to cost a lot more. Trials take longer. They have additional work to do with relation to the death penalty. And in many states, both sides have to have a death penalty qualified attorney. And those attorneys have to be specially trained. One study concluded it cost Maryland taxpayers $1.1 million to prosecute a case without the death penalty and $3 million to prosecute a case with the death penalty. In Kohberger's case, we know that trial was expected to take 3 months. The state has to furnish the courthouse, the jury, which has to be paid, although rarely very much, and they have to pay the judge. The state had 5 lawyers, I think, and a host of support staff who would be helping. The defense had multiple lawyers. They had support staff as well. Both the costs of prosecuting Kohberger and the costs of defending him are paid by taxpayers. If Kohberger got the death penalty, he would be housed in solitary confinement, what people call death row. Individual housing, so it costs more than group housing would. Taking that into account, the California Commission on the Fair Administration of Justice figured the death penalty system was costing California $137 million a year, and the state could lower that amount to $11.5 million by switching to life without parole. The appeals process goes on and on and on in multiple rounds, many years, and that carries costs. Prosecutors have to consider some of those long-term impacts when they decide whether to seek the death penalty. The fourth reason is that it's a lot harder to execute someone than you might think. It will probably surprise you to learn that it has become almost impossible to get the drugs for a lethal injection. Pharmaceutical companies are under pressure from groups that oppose the death penalty, and they won't sell the drugs to the states. Kohberger pled guilty in Idaho, but Idaho, even though it has the death penalty, hasn't executed anyone since 2012. And the reason was that the state hasn't been able to get the drugs. In 2024, they tried to execute a man named Thomas Creech. He had been convicted of 5 murders, and they were trying to execute him for the beating death of a 22-year-old disabled fellow inmate in 1981. They tried 8 locations on his body to get a viable vein, and they couldn't, so it was halted. It is not clear where Idaho got the pentobarbital that they were going to use. There was speculation, maybe they got it overseas, maybe they got it from a veterinary source, but under Idaho law, they don't have to disclose it. In 2023, the Idaho legislature did pass a backup plan, a plan that would authorize authorities to use a firing squad. It's an acknowledgement of how difficult it is to actually obtain the drugs. The chief beauty of giving someone life without parole as opposed to the death penalty is that it is certain that Bryan Kohberger has agreed he will not appeal. The case is over. There's benefit to that also to the families of the victims. Here, some of the families strongly favored the death penalty, and they are understandably upset at the idea that the death penalty is off the table. That is entirely understandable. These people lost their children or their siblings, their loved ones. But the prosecutor is thinking of the fact that 20 years from now, when the execution of Bryan Kohberger is set and the case is going through yet another round of appeals, the families may be asked all over again about what happened to their loved ones. It's not going to go away. Reporters may be sticking a microphone in their face and saying, "How are you feeling today, knowing that Bryan Kohberger is going to be executed tomorrow? Do you think it will actually happen this time?" So if you're wondering how the state could possibly agree to this deal, it isn't because they're soft, or it isn't because they don't care. It isn't even because they're trying to avoid hard work, 3 months of a trial. What it comes down to is this. Right now, seeking the death penalty is almost unavoidably too expensive in our nation. It is a 20-year war, and most of the time, the end result is not even that the person gets executed. It usually just ends up being a life sentence that takes 2 decades and millions of dollars to reach. Kohberger's case, just like any death penalty case, would have required enormous resources, money, time, attorney time, energy, and it would have taken an incredible toll on the victims' families. For all that high price, the outcome very likely would have been the exact same, which is that Bryan Kohberger is going to die in prison. The prosecution is realizing that this plea brings certainty. It brings finality. It locks Kohberger away for life without an appeal, without another courtroom appearance, no more media circus. The families absolutely 100% should have been included. Not including them at every step is inexcusable, frankly. But if you are trying to understand why the state made this deal, this is probably why. Right now, we need to figure out what we want to do about the death penalty in our country. Either we believe it's important or we don't, because the system we have right now is broken and it's not working. We supposedly have the death penalty, but it is not, practically speaking, something that we are really willing to do or that we are able to do. Cost wise, it's prohibitive. Every day, prosecutors are making decisions just like the ones in the Kohberger case. We need to make our decision. If we believe in the death penalty, we need to make it viable again. If we do not believe in the death penalty, we need to pull it. Here on the channel, we cover legal cases that are in the news. Be sure to like and subscribe. I'd love to have you back for more videos.